James Wilson smiled as he walked through his new front door, dropping his keys on the small table in the hallway. After months of searching, endless paperwork, and a stressful moving process, he had finally settled into his home at Oak Ridge Community. The modest three-bedroom house with its small but well-kept yard was everything he had worked for over the past decade. At 34, James had climbed the ranks at his software company, saved diligently, and finally made the leap from his downtown apartment to this peaceful suburban neighborhood. The community boasted tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, or so the realtor had promised, and amenities that included a tennis court, playground, and a sparkling community pool. It was this pool that caught James's attention as he glanced at the calendar on his kitchen wall. Sunday, his first free day since moving in 3 weeks ago. The mountain of boxes had finally been unpacked, his furniture arranged just how he liked it, and the endless trips to hardware stores seemed to be coming to an end. Time for a break, James said to himself, his decision made. He packed a small cooler with some drinks and snacks, grabbed the latest thriller novel he'd been too busy to start, and tucked a fluffy blue towel under his arm. Before heading out, he made sure to grab his new resident keycard from the welcome packet that had been waiting for him when he moved in. The summer heat hit him as soon as he stepped outside. The Georgia sun was unforgiving in July, making the idea of a cool swim all the more appealing. James nodded at an older man watering plants across the street. The man gave a polite wave back. As James walked the 3 blocks to the community pool, he took in his new surroundings. Children rode bikes with colorful streamers flying from the handlebars. Couples walked dogs along the sidewalk. A group of teenagers passed a basketball back and forth as they made their way to the courts. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he decided to move to Oak Ridge. After years of city living with its constant noise and anonymous neighbors, James wanted community. He wanted to know the people who lived around him and to feel like he belonged. The community pool came into view as he rounded the final corner. It was a large rectangle of bright blue water surrounded by lounge chairs and a few tables with umbrellas. A small building housed changing rooms and bathrooms. A sign with pool rules hung prominently by the entrance gate. James approached the gate and swiped his keycard. The little light turned green, and the lock clicked open. He stepped inside, immediately feeling the different atmosphere. The sounds of splashing water, children laughing, and quiet conversations filled the air. There weren't many people there yet. A family with young children occupied the shallow end. 2 older women did slow laps in designated swimming lanes. A teenager sat at the edge with feet dangling in the water while scrolling through a phone. James found an empty lounge chair in a quiet corner, spread his towel over it, and set down his things. He took a deep breath of the chlorine-scented air and felt tension leave his shoulders. This was exactly what he needed. He sat down, opened his book, and began to read, occasionally looking up to enjoy the peaceful scene around him. The water sparkled under the sun. A light breeze made the heat bearable. For the first time in weeks, James felt truly relaxed. This was a good choice, he thought to himself, taking a sip from his water bottle. I'm really going to like living here. Little did James know that his peaceful Sunday afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn. James had just finished the first chapter of his book when a shadow fell across his lounge chair. He looked up, squinting against the sun, to see a woman standing over him with her arms crossed. She wore a floral swimsuit cover-up and large sunglasses that hid much of her face. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the ambient pool sounds. "May I see your pool pass?" James blinked, surprised by the direct question from a stranger. He nodded politely and reached for his wallet to show his new resident keycard. "Here it is," he said, holding up the card with the Oak Ridge Community logo clearly visible. "I just moved in a few weeks ago." The woman, Diane Mercer, barely glanced at the card. She pushed her sunglasses to the top of her head, revealing narrowed eyes that studied James with open suspicion. "That doesn't look like our community cards," she said. "I've lived here for 8 years, and I know everyone. I've never seen you before." James took a deep breath, maintaining his calm. "Like I said, I'm new. I bought the Henderson house on Maple Street, just moved in 3 weeks ago." Diane's eyebrows rose. "The Henderson house? On Maple?" Her tone made it clear she didn't believe him. "I'm on the Homeowners Association board, and I keep track of all new residents. I don't remember approving anyone new for that property. A few people nearby had stopped what they were doing to watch the interaction. The family in the shallow end quieted their splashing. The teenager at the pool's edge looked up from their phone. "Ma'am, I assure you, I live here now," James said, his voice still even despite growing discomfort. "I have every right to use this pool." Diane's face flushed slightly. "Well, I've never seen you at any community events. And frankly, we've had problems with non-residents sneaking in and causing trouble." She gestured vaguely around the pool area. "This is private property for Oak Ridge residents only." James sat up straighter, closing his book. "I understand you're concerned about community security, but I am a resident. Here's my key card again." He held it up higher. "Notice how I got through the locked gate? Because I have a valid access card." Diane waved her hand dismissively. "Those cards can be copied or stolen. For all I know, you jumped the fence." A few gasps came from nearby listeners. James felt his heart rate increasing, but he worked to keep his expression neutral. He had been through similar situations before and knew that showing anger would only make things worse. "I did not jump any fence. I used my key card at the gate, which I have because I live here," he repeated firmly. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to continue enjoying my Sunday." Diane's face hardened. "I do mind, actually. As a concerned resident, I have a responsibility to make sure our facilities aren't being misused." She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the property management office right now." James nodded. "That's fine. They can confirm that I live here." As Diane stepped away to make her call, James noticed more people watching now. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, and a few seemed embarrassed by Diane's behavior. No one approached to help, however. James felt the familiar weight of being singled out settle on his shoulders. He had hoped this community would be different. He had checked it out carefully before buying his home, looking for a place where he would feel welcome. Now, on his first visit to the community pool, he was being treated like an intruder. The peaceful afternoon he had looked forward to was slipping away, replaced by an all-too-familiar tension. Diane returned, phone still in hand. "The office isn't answering," she said. "It's Sunday after all. So I'm going to have to ask you to leave until we can verify your residency tomorrow." James shook his head slowly. "No, I won't be leaving. I live here, and I have every right to use this pool." The standoff had only just begun. Diane's face turned a deeper shade of red as she realized James wasn't going to simply pack up and leave. She took a step closer, her voice rising. "I don't think you understand. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm telling you to leave." She gestured forcefully toward the gate. "This is a private community pool for verified residents only." James remained seated but reached for his phone on the small table beside him. With calm, deliberate movements, he opened his camera app and began recording. "I understand this is a private pool," he said evenly. "That's why I bought a house here, so I could use facilities like this." Diane noticed the phone and her eyes widened. "Are you recording me?" "That's not allowed." "There's no rule against recording in a public space," James replied. "And I think it's important to document this interaction." By now, the pool area had grown oddly quiet. The family in the shallow end had gathered their children close. The older women had stopped swimming and stood waist-deep in the water, watching. A couple who had been sunbathing nearby sat up, exchanging concerned glances. "If you don't stop recording and leave right now, I'm calling the police," Diane threatened, holding up her phone. James nodded, still recording. "You're welcome to do that. I'm not breaking any laws by being at my community pool." "This is harassment," Diane exclaimed, her voice echoing across the water. "You're harassing me now." "I'm simply sitting here," James responded. "You approached me, demanded to see my pass, and now you're telling me to leave despite me showing you proof that I live here." Diane began dialing on her phone, turning away slightly but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, hello. I need to report a trespasser at the Oak Ridge community pool. He's refusing to leave and he's being threatening." James sighed but continued recording. "I am not threatening anyone," he said clearly for the benefit of his video. "I'm just sitting by the pool at my own community." A middle-aged couple who had been watching from their chairs finally stood up and approached. The woman, Tara Jenkins, spoke first. "Diane, what's going on here?" she asked, looking between the two of them. "This man claims he lives here, but I've never seen him before," Diane said, covering her phone briefly. "I'm calling the police." The man, Marcus Jenkins, turned to James with a confused expression. Don't you live in the Henderson place? I think I saw you moving in a few weeks back. James nodded, relief washing over his face at finally having someone recognize him. Yes, that's right. 347 Maple Street. I moved in 3 weeks ago. Tara smiled. We're just across the street from you. I meant to bring over a welcome basket, but things got busy. Diane interrupted. How do you know he's not just saying that? Have you actually confirmed he lives there? Marcus frowned. Diane, we've seen him coming and going. He drives that silver Accord that's parked in the driveway. That doesn't prove anything, Diane insisted, then returned to her phone call. Yes, I'm still here. We have an unauthorized person who won't leave. More residents have begun to take notice now. A woman with gray hair called out from her chair, Diane, leave the young man alone. If he has a key card, he belongs here. Another resident, a middle-aged man, stood up. I saw this gentleman at the mailboxes yesterday. He definitely lives here. Diane seemed momentarily flustered by the growing opposition but doubled down. None of you were on the welcoming committee meeting last month. We didn't approve any new residents for Maple Street. James, still recording, spoke clearly. I purchased my home through normal channels. I didn't need your personal approval to move into the neighborhood. That's not how it works here, Diane said firmly. Yes, officer, she continued into her phone. Please come quickly. The situation is escalating. Marcus Jenkins shook his head in disbelief. Diane, you're making a huge mistake. You can't just demand people leave because you personally don't recognize them. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Diane's face as she realized more neighbors were watching and several had begun recording the incident on their phones. The afternoon had transformed from a peaceful pool day into a tense standoff that would soon change the entire community. The tension around the pool area continued to build as more residents gathered to watch the confrontation. Some whispered among themselves while others openly recorded the scene on their phones. James remained seated, his own phone still documenting the incident. The police are on their way, Diane announced loudly, putting her phone back into her small pool bag. They'll sort this out quickly. Marcus Jenkins shook his head and turned to face the growing crowd. Does anyone here have Sarah Miller's number? She's the actual HOA president. We should call her about this. A young woman in a red swimsuit raised her hand. I have her number. I'll text her now. Diane crossed her arms, looking increasingly uncomfortable as more neighbors seemed to side with James. Sarah will back me up. We have procedures for a reason. Tara Jenkins sat down on the edge of the lounge chair next to James. I'm so sorry about this. This isn't how we welcome new neighbors in Oak Ridge. Some of us do, an older man called out from his chair. Diane's been pulling this kind of thing for years. Several heads nodded in agreement, which only made Diane's expression harden further. I'm just trying to keep our community safe, she insisted. None of you seem to care about security protocols. James took a deep breath and decided to try one more time to defuse the situation. He put his phone down but left it recording. Ms. Mercer, I understand you're concerned about community safety. That's one reason I chose Oak Ridge. It seemed like a secure, well-maintained neighborhood. But there has to be a better way to verify new residents than confronting them this way. There is, came a new voice from the pool gate. A woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and wearing business casual clothes despite the weekend had arrived. Sarah Miller, the HOA president, swiped her card and walked briskly toward the group. Diane, what's happening here? I got 3 different text messages about some kind of disturbance. Before Diane could answer, Sarah spotted James and her expression brightened. Mr. Wilson, right? I'm sorry I wasn't there when you picked up your welcome packet. How are you settling in? James felt a wave of relief. I was doing well until today, he said honestly. Sarah looked between James and Diane, quickly assessing the situation. Diane, did you question Mr. Wilson's right to be here? I was just trying to verify. Diane began. Mr. Wilson completed all the proper paperwork when he purchased the Henderson property, Sarah interrupted. His name and information were in last month's HOA newsletter, which I know you receive. A murmur went through the gathered crowd. Diane's face flushed deeper. I must have missed that issue, she said stiffly. Sarah turned to address the onlookers. Everyone, I apologize for this disruption to your Sunday. Mr. Wilson is indeed a new and welcome member of our community. There's been a misunderstanding. One of the older women who had been swimming earlier spoke up. This isn't just a misunderstanding, Sarah. This is the third time this summer Diane has confronted someone at the pool. Remember the Rodriguez family last month? And the college students visiting the Thompsons before that, someone else added. Sarah's expression grew more serious. I see. Diane, we need to talk privately about this pattern. But first, she turned back to James. Mr. Wilson, I want to personally apologize for this unfortunate welcome to our community facilities. James nodded his appreciation but remained quiet, aware that every word and reaction was being recorded by multiple phones now. In the distance, the faint sound of police sirens could be heard approaching the neighborhood. You actually called the police? Sarah asked Diane, her voice a mixture of disbelief and anger, over a resident using the pool. Diane shifted uncomfortably. I was concerned about. Save it, Sarah cut her off. We'll discuss this at the emergency board meeting I'm calling for tomorrow evening. She turned back to James. Mr. Wilson, would you be willing to attend as well? I think it's important for the board to hear directly from you about this experience. James thought for a moment before responding. Yes, I'll be there. I think it's important we address what happened today. The sirens grew louder as everyone waited to see what would happen next. 2 police officers arrived at the pool gate, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. Officer Davis, a tall man with a serious expression, and Officer Chen, a shorter woman with alert eyes, surveyed the unusual scene. A large group of residents gathered around James and Diane, with Sarah standing between them. Someone called about a trespasser, Officer Chen asked, her hand resting casually on her belt as she glanced around. Sarah stepped forward immediately. Officers, thank you for coming, but I'm afraid this was a misunderstanding. I'm Sarah Miller, that ETOA president, and there is no trespasser here. Diane pushed past Sarah. I'm the one who called. This man. She pointed at James, refused to leave when I questioned his right to be here. Officer Davis took out a small notepad. And you are? Diane Mercer. I'm on the ETOA board, she said with confidence. Sarah shook her head. Diane is a committee volunteer, not a board member. And Mr. Wilson here is a legitimate resident who was simply enjoying the pool when he was wrongfully confronted. The officers looked at each other, clearly realizing this wasn't the emergency situation they had been called for. Officer Chen approached James, who was still sitting calmly. Sir, can I see some ID, please? She asked professionally. James nodded and reached slowly for his wallet, pulling out his driver's license. My name is James Wilson. I moved into 347 Maple Street 3 weeks ago. Officer Chen examined the license and handed it back. And you have proof of residency. James showed her his pool keycard and pulled up a photo on his phone of his closing documents for the house. While Officer Chen spoke with James, Officer Davis was talking to Sarah and several other residents who had eagerly volunteered information about what happened. She does this all the time, one woman was saying. Always to the same type of people, if you know what I mean. Officer Davis's expression remained neutral as he took notes. After a few minutes, the officers conferred quietly, then Officer Chen addressed the crowd. Folks, it appears there's been a misunderstanding today. Mr. Wilson is clearly a resident with every right to be here. There's no crime being committed. She turned to Diane. Ma'am, in the future, please leave security concerns to your AOA management or the police if there's an actual emergency. Diane's face had lost its redness, replaced by a pale, tight expression. I was just trying to protect our community, she insisted, but her voice had lost its earlier conviction. Making false police reports is a serious matter, Officer Davis added. We've had a lot of calls to this community recently for similar issues. Sarah stepped in quickly. Officers, thank you for your time. We'll be addressing this internally at our 8OA level. She handed them her card. Please feel free to contact me directly if there are any further concerns about our community. The police nodded and prepared to leave, but before they did, Officer Chen approached James one more time. Sir, would you like to file a formal complaint about this incident? She asked quietly. James considered the question carefully, aware that everyone was watching. Not at this time, he finally said. I'd like to see how the community handles it first." The officers left, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the pool area. Many residents looked embarrassed. Others seemed relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further. Diane stood alone, clutching her pool bag tightly. Sarah broke the silence. "I think we've all had enough excitement for one day. The pool remains open for all residents to enjoy." She gave Diane a pointed look. "Diane, I'll walk you out. We need to talk." As they left, residents began to disperse, some returning to swimming, others packing up to leave. The Jenkins couple stayed near James. "Are you really okay?" Tara asked him. James nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm fine." He glanced at his phone, which had recorded the entire incident. Just not exactly the relaxing pool day I had planned. Marcus offered his hand. "For what it's worth, most of us are glad you're here. Don't let this change how you feel about Oak Ridge." James shook his hand, appreciating the gesture but still processing everything that had happened. In just one afternoon, he had become the center of a community controversy, all because he wanted to enjoy the pool at his new home. "Thank you," he said simply, unsure what else to say. James didn't sleep well that night. He tossed and turned, replaying the pool incident in his mind. Around 3 a.m., he finally gave up on sleep and sat at his kitchen counter with a cup of herbal tea. Almost without thinking, he opened his phone and looked at the video he had recorded. The footage was clear. Diane's accusations, the gathering crowd, the police arrival, all captured in high definition. James stared at the screen for a long moment, then opened his social media app. "Do I really want to do this?" he asked himself quietly. After several minutes of consideration, he wrote a simple caption. "My first visit to my new community pool today. This was not the welcome I expected." He attached the video and pressed post before he could change his mind. James finally fell asleep around dawn, his phone plugged in on his nightstand. When he woke up at 9 a.m., he was shocked to see over 200 notifications. The video had already been shared thousands of times overnight. His phone rang almost immediately, a local news station wanting to interview him. Then another call, and another. James declined them all, suddenly overwhelmed by the attention. He had only intended to share his experience, not create a media storm. By noon, the video had reached over 500,000 views. #OakRidgePool incident was trending in the region. Commenters were calling Diane Pool Karen and expressing outrage over what they saw as clear racial profiling. James's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Miller. "Are you seeing what's happening online? Can we meet to talk about this?" They arranged to meet at a coffee shop a few miles from the neighborhood to avoid drawing attention. When James arrived, Sarah was already there, looking tired. "I had no idea this would blow up like this," James said as he sat down across from her. Sarah nodded. "Social media works quickly these days." She took a sip of her coffee. "I've received over 100 emails from residents since last night. Everyone has an opinion." "I'm sorry if this made things more complicated," James said sincerely. "Don't apologize. You did nothing wrong," Sarah insisted. "Actually, many residents are thankful this is finally being addressed. Diane's behavior has been a problem for a while, but it was always handled quietly." James's phone buzzed again with another news request. He ignored it. "What happens now?" he asked. "The emergency board meeting is still on for tonight. It's closed to general residents, but as the directly affected party, you're invited to attend." Sarah looked at him seriously. "Your presence would make a difference." James hesitated. "I didn't move here to become an activist or the center of attention." "I understand," Sarah said, "but sometimes these moments choose us, not the other way around." When James returned home, he was surprised to find a small gathering of neighbors on his front lawn. They weren't protesters or journalists, but actual Oak Ridge residents, families with children, older couples, young professionals. Tara Jenkins stepped forward when she saw him. "We wanted to welcome you properly," she said, handing him a basket filled with local treats, gift cards, and a bottle of wine. "And to say we're sorry about yesterday." Marcus added, "We also wanted you to know that most of us don't share Diane's views. That's not who we are as a community." James was touched by the gesture. He noticed a news van slowly driving down the street, clearly looking for his house. "Would you all like to come inside?" he offered. "I think we're about to have unwanted company." As they moved inside, someone asked if he would be attending the board meeting. Looking around at the diverse group of neighbors who had come to support him, James made his decision. "Yes," he said firmly. "I think I need to be there." By evening, when James drove to the community center for the meeting, the video had reached 2 million views. As he parked, he noticed several news vans outside and residents gathering, many wearing blue ribbons that he later learned symbolized community solidarity. The incident was no longer just about one afternoon at the pool. It had become a moment of reckoning for the entire Oak Ridge community. The Oak Ridge Community Center conference room was designed to hold 30 people comfortably. Tonight, more than 60 crowded inside, with others peering through the windows and doorway. Despite Sarah's announcement that this was a closed board meeting, residents had shown up in unprecedented. The 5 HOA board members sat at a table at the front of the room. Sarah Miller sat in the center as president, flanked by Treasurer Ron Thompson, Secretary Vivian Lee, and members Anthony Guzman and Patricia Wilson, no relation to James. Noticeably absent was Diane Mercer. James found a seat near the back, trying to remain low-key despite numerous supportive nods and whispers of "that's him" as he entered. Marcus and Tara Jenkins took seats beside him in silent solidarity. Sarah called the meeting to order with 3 sharp taps of her gavel. "Thank you all for coming. While this is technically a closed board meeting, given the circumstances and community interest, we're allowing residents to observe. However, only board members and invited speakers will address the group." She continued, "As most of you know, yesterday an incident occurred at our community pool involving new resident James Wilson and longtime resident Diane Mercer. A video of this incident has gone viral online, bringing unwanted attention to our community." A murmur went through the crowd. Sarah raised her hand for silence. "Before we begin formal proceedings, I want to acknowledge Mr. Wilson." She gestured toward James. "On behalf of the board and the entire Oak Ridge community, I want to formally apologize for your experience yesterday." Applause broke out, surprising James. He nodded in acknowledgement, feeling slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "Now, regarding Ms. Mercer," Sarah continued when the room quieted. "The board has reviewed the video evidence, spoken with witnesses, and considered previous complaints. This was not, as some have suggested, an isolated incident or misunderstanding." Anthony Guzman, a board member in his 40s, leaned forward. "We documented 7 similar incidents in the past 2 years, all involving Ms. Mercer questioning the presence of residents of color or their guests at our facilities." More murmurs filled the room. Many residents looked shocked, while others nodded knowingly. Patricia Wilson, the oldest board member, spoke next. "Diane was invited to attend tonight but declined. She did submit a written statement, which I'll summarize. She maintains she was acting out of concern for community safety, denies any racial motivation, and believes she's being unfairly portrayed online." Someone in the back called out, "The video speaks for itself." Others voiced agreement. Sarah tapped her gavel again. "Please, let's maintain order." Vivian Lee, the board secretary, cleared her throat. "After careful consideration, and per our community bylaws regarding harassment, the board has voted unanimously to remove Diane Mercer from all volunteer positions, including her pool committee role and neighborhood watch coordinator." Applause erupted again, louder this time. Ron Thompson, the treasurer, added, "Additionally, she will receive a formal warning that any similar behavior in the future could result in fines as outlined in our community covenants." Sarah nodded. "But we recognize this isn't just about one person. This incident has revealed larger issues within our community that need addressing." She unfolded a piece of paper. "Tonight, the board is proposing a new Oak Ridge Community Inclusion Initiative with several components. First, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all committee volunteers and board members. Second, a revision of our welcome procedures for new residents to ensure everyone feels genuinely welcomed. Third, a new community event series specifically designed to help neighbors meet and connect across different backgrounds." Patricia Wilson added, "And fourth, a clear, public reporting system for any resident who experiences discrimination or harassment within our community." Sarah looked directly at James. "Mr. Wilson, we've reserved time for you to speak, if you wish to." All eyes turned to James. He hadn't prepared anything formal, but as he stood, He knew exactly what he wanted to say. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I didn't move to Oak Ridge looking for controversy. I just wanted a home in a good community. Yesterday was disappointing, but what's happened since then? Neighbors coming together, this meeting, these new initiatives, that's encouraging. Real change doesn't come from viral videos or public outrage. It comes from communities willing to look at themselves honestly and do better. I'm still glad I chose Oak Ridge, and I look forward to being part of its future." The room erupted in applause as James sat down, feeling, for the first time since the incident, that something positive might emerge from this difficult beginning. 6 months after the pool incident, Oak Ridge community had transformed in ways few residents could have predicted. The viral video had faded from public attention, but its impact remained in the daily life of the neighborhood. On a crisp Saturday morning in January, James walked toward the community center, where volunteers were setting up for the first Oak Ridge Cultural Festival. Colorful banners hung from lampposts along the main street, and the smell of various foods filled the air as residents prepared dishes representing their diverse backgrounds. James, perfect timing, called Sarah Miller, who spotted him approaching. "Can you help Marcus set up the welcome table?" James nodded and headed over to where Marcus Jenkins was arranging name tags and community maps. "Morning, neighbor," Marcus said with a warm smile. "Hard to believe it's been 6 months since that day at the pool, isn't it?" James helped straighten the stack of programs. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, other times it feels like a lifetime ago." The changes in Oak Ridge had been both swift and meaningful. The Inclusion Initiative had officially launched just 1 week after the emergency meeting. The board had hired professional trainers to conduct monthly workshops on diversity and inclusion, which became surprisingly popular among residents. The community newsletter now featured profiles of new residents each month, complete with photos and short interviews to help everyone feel recognized. Most noticeably, attendance at community events had doubled. People who had previously kept to themselves were now participating actively in neighborhood affairs. "Have you seen today's program?" Marcus asked, handing James a colorful brochure. James scanned it, noting the diverse lineup of activities. Cooking demonstrations from 10 different cultural traditions, children's games from around the world, music performances, and a community potluck to end the day. "Looks impressive," James said. "Who's coordinating all this?" "You're looking at the committee chair," came a familiar voice from behind him. James turned to see Tara Jenkins approaching with a clipboard. After the incident, Tara had volunteered to lead the new cultural committee, throwing herself into creating events that would bring the community together. "The cooking demos start in 30 minutes, she said. "Oh, and James, that reporter from the local paper wants to talk to you about the changes here since the video. I told her you'd think about it." James had declined most interview requests over the past months, preferring to focus on settling into the community rather than revisiting the incident. But today felt different. "Sure, I'll talk to her," he decided. "It's a good story to tell now." As the festival got underway, James watched residents of all ages and backgrounds mingling freely. Children ran between activity stations while adults chatted in mixed groups that would have been unusual just months earlier. Even some of the older residents who had initially resisted the changes were now actively participating. Near the entrance, James noticed a familiar figure hesitantly approaching, Diane Mercer. She had kept a low profile since the incident, rarely attending community events. Today, she carried a covered dish and looked nervous. Sarah spotted her too and walked over immediately. After a brief conversation, Sarah led Diane to the potluck table, where she placed her dish among the others. A few residents nodded politely in her direction. James decided it was time. He walked over to where Diane stood slightly apart from the crowd. "Hello, Diane," he said simply. She looked startled. "James, I wasn't sure if I should come today." "I'm glad you did," he replied honestly. "That's what community is about. Everyone belongs." Diane's eyes grew moist. "I've been taking those workshops. They've been educational." James nodded. "We're all learning." A small child ran between them, breaking the moment of tension. The festival continued around them, a living example of what Oak Ridge was becoming. Later, speaking to the reporter, James was asked if he regretted posting the video that had changed everything. "No," he answered thoughtfully. "Communities can't grow without facing their problems. What happened that day was difficult, but look around. He gestured to the festival in full swing. Sometimes it takes an uncomfortable moment to create real change. Oak Ridge isn't perfect, but we're working on it together, and that's what matters in the end. As the day continued, James realized he had finally found what he'd been looking for all along, not just a house, but a true home in a community that was willing to grow, change, and truly welcome everyone.